Okay, one more video on service workers. This time I want to talk about how to integrate IndexedDB with service workers. If you don't know anything about IndexedDB, I've got a link right there at the top to my playlist on IndexedDB. About 2.5 hours worth of content on IndexedDB. The first one talks about using Jake Archibald's IDB keyval library. So if you just want to use a little bit of a little bit of IndexedDB, just like you're working with local storage, you can use that library. If you really want to get into it, the rest of the playlist is all about vanilla JavaScript and actually using the IndexedDB API to fully use it. And that's what I'm going to be using here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this form. I'm going to fill in a name, pick a color, save it. I want to send that to the service worker and then have the service worker save that data in an index database. So over here, in my application tab, my service worker, right now it's not doing any of the saving, but it is creating my database. And inside of there, I'm creating a store. There's going to be an ID, a name, and a color, just like the object that we're creating in this form from the previous video. My caches, they're working the same as they did in the last couple of videos, so no changes there. It's just going to be this using the messaging ability to send data to the service worker. Then we're going to save the data in the index database. Then we're going to send a message back to the web page and use that as a trigger to then talk to the IndexedDB from the web page and list off all of the people that we've saved so far. So let's jump into the code and see what we're doing. Okay, in the web page, one new thing I've added. Just below the form, I've added an unordered list called people, and that's where we're going to be adding the content. That's the only change in the HTML from the previous video. Inside of my web page script, a couple of changes up here at the top. I need to have a database variable that I can use and reference from multiple functions. This is going to be when I open the database, I need to keep a reference to it so I can use it later on. And then inside my init function, I'm going to call a function to actually connect with that database. And that's going to be down here at the very bottom, right down here. And I've got a fair number of the code chunks already written in here. There's a couple that I'm going to write, but I've got a few of them just because this is rehashing stuff that I've covered in the other playlist. So I'm opening up this IndexedDB, and when it works, when it's successful, I'm going to call my showPeople function. The showPeople function is going to check to make sure, hey, did you actually connect? Do you have a database reference saved? If you do, then we're going to create a transaction, talk to the database, get the list of people so we can build the data out. So this is going to be our final step, actually building that list out. On message, this is when the data comes back from the service worker, and this is going to be our trigger to call showPeople. ShowPeople is going to check for the database. If we don't have the connection, it's going to call OpenDB, and then it will go back to showPeople and run it again to try and display that list. In the service worker, we've added same thing. There's a global variable called DB. This is going to be a reference to the database. And in the service worker, what we're going to do is inside the activate listener, we've got our check for the caches where we're deleting the old versions of the caches, caches.delete. When that is successful, after that's done, we're going to call a function to open the database. And that's down here at the bottom, same as it was on the other page. Very similar. It does have a success, and it does have an error listener. The one extra thing that it has is this is where I'm going to create the store. On upgraded needed, this event listener fires every time you open up a database. If the version number has changed from what was there before, or if the database didn't exist before, it's going to trigger this event, the on upgrade needed. And I'm going to look to see, hey, do I have a store inside my database called color store? If I don't, I'm going to create it, and my primary key is going to be the ID property. So back to the service worker, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change to my service worker. I'm going to change the version number so we can see this actually happening. We make a change right here, And we'll go back to our page here, skip the waiting, and refresh this. We have the latest version. Come down here. There's version 2 of our database was created, and there's the store being created. So we have that. That's being done right here inside the activate event. So this is the best time. Whenever you're changing the version, you're activating a new service worker, that's a good time to check and make sure that whether or not you need to create the database and update anything about the database. Okay, so we have that done, and I've got a callback function here. So if at some point in the future I've lost the reference to my database, my service worker's still there, but it shut down and then had to restart, and for whatever reason I've lost the connection to my database, what I've done is I've given myself the ability to recall this function again from someplace else in my code, like when I'm doing something with the messaging. I can, when I receive a message, so in my message event listener, I can, at this point, if I don't have the database, I can call that function to reopen it. I can check for the database, call the open, and then after that, I need to call some other function. So that's my callback that I'm going to pass in here. Open it. When I get the success event, meaning I have finished successfully opening the database, I'm going to call my callback, if that was passed in. All right, so let's start with that, actually. Let's jump back to the onMessage listener. We had this before, but all we were doing previously in the previous video, if I shrink this down, inside of here, the only part that we were doing was sort of this bit right here. We were coming up with a message and building an object that we were going to send back to the browser, calling our send message function, and that hasn't changed at all. We're still going to pass in the message, let it find all the clients or the matching client, and send the message back. So that is the same as the previous video that we did. Link to that right here. Okay, now back up to our message listener. This happens when the person is in the browser, they've filled out the form, and they've clicked the submit button. So this is going to send the object right here with the name, the ID, and the color over to the service worker. So ev.data, that's going to be the person object. There's a property inside of data called addPerson, and it contains the person object. All right, so all the things that we want to do. Wait for the opening of the database if we don't have it. We need to start a transaction, and we have to add the data. So we're going to call, actually, we're going to use the put method to put the data into there. So let's do this. Right now, I'm just logging out the DB object just to show that I have it. So let's run this once. There it is. So save. This is the object that we're sending from app.js over to the service worker. And in the service worker, here's our database object. So we do have the database object right here. We've just created it. Our service worker's still up and running, so we're good to go. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't check. So I'm going to comment that out. So we'll say if our database object exists, then what we're going to do is we're going to start our transaction, and that's going to be done inside of our save person. So we do want to call save person. So we're going to call our save person function, which is right here, if we do have the database. If we don't, then what we're going to do is we're going to call OpenDB, and we're going to pass it a callback function. Now I could have a name here and say, hey, this is the name of the function to call, or I can just write a little inline function like this. Here's my anonymous function that I'm passing in to OpenDB. That's my callback function. So after the database has been successfully opened, I'm doing the same thing. Save person. So in either case, whether I've got the database or I just have to open it, I'm going to call save person. And down here, we create our transaction, put in some error handling. When it's successful, we use the code that we had before to send a message back to the browser saying, yeah, we've saved this person. And we're sending back a copy of the person that we just saved under the property name of saved person. This is going to become something we can listen for in the browser script. So we can say, oh, okay, we just received a message. Does it have a property called saved person? If it does, there's the person that I just saved if I want to do something specifically with that. But the existence of this property called saved person, that's a trigger for me to update the list that I have on the page. All right, now the things that we're passing in to saved person. There's the person object, which we already have. That's the add person inside of data. So data.addPerson. And then the client ID we have right here. So it's the same things. Either way, it's just, do we want to wait, or do we need to wait to open the database again, or can I just call the saved person? Inside of saved person, connect to the color store, error listening, the onComplete to send the message that we just talked about, and then this right here. This is the code that we need. We have to let the transaction connect to the object store, which is the one called color store. So we get a reference to that, and it's on this store object that we can call our put method and pass in our person. This is the person that was just passed here. If you need to do something else with your data after you've saved it, if there's something else you need to do in the service worker after saving it, this is a good place to do it right here, inside the onSuccess function. The onSuccess for the request, if it's the last request in the transaction, this will automatically call commit on the transaction, which is going to trigger the onComplete listener that we have right here, and that's the thing that will send the message back. So we save that, and there we go. That's it. That's all we needed to do. So the open database, the error handler, the onUpgrade needed, the success handler, those are going to be called from the activate event, as well as when we receive the message if the database connection no longer exists. And then inside of our message listener, we do our check for the database, call save person. Save person creates a transaction, connects to the store, calls the put method to save the person, and then when the transaction is complete, it calls the send message, which is the exact same as what we had in the last video, to send it back to the browser. Okay, so let's test this out. We'll jump over to our service worker, skip waiting so we get the latest version. We haven't changed the version number here, so this is still the same store, same database. Cache hasn't changed at all. It's just the service worker itself. So we're going to refresh this just to make sure we're dealing with the latest controller. Let's add a name. We've got a color. Click Save. So save, and this was received. So let's go look in the database. It says data may have been modified. Refresh. And there it is. We've actually saved this in our database. And again, now we have two objects in our database. So that's working great. Now, what we need to do is we need to do something here with this. So the web page receiving, it's getting back the message from the service worker to say, hey, I just saved somebody. So we're going to listen for the saved person property inside of our message, and that's going to be the trigger for us to build the list. And we're just going to be kind of repeating the same process we did in the service worker. So we have our database object. We're going to open up the database when the page loads. On message, this is the one that we're just looking at right here in the console. The one that's got saved person inside of it. So we're going to look for saved person inside of data. I know that this is updated, so I'm going to call my show people right here. This is going to be the thing that connects to the database, gets the full list, and writes it out. So show people, and I'm also going to, if I got to this point, this form right here, with whatever name I just wrote, we're going to clear that out because at this point, I've sent it to the service worker, it was saved in the service worker sent me a message back saying, hey, everything worked out, it was successful. So this is the good, perfect time for us to clear that out. So it's going to be this one right here, the field with the ID name. There we go. So that's cleared out. Now, show people, we need to check for the database, and if we don't have it, we're going to open up the database. Oh, missing my eye. So if app.db does not exist, then we're going to call app.opendb. So this function can be called as many times as we want, and if db doesn't exist, it's going to try to open it. And it's only on successful reopening or opening of the database that we're going to call this again. Inside of here, we should have an error listener. Inside of here, we're not calling show people. If we did that from here, we'd be getting into a situation where it's like an infinite loop. Hey, database doesn't exist, open it. Okay, it doesn't exist, try this again. Oh, does the database exist? No, okay, open it. And it would just keep looping and looping and looping. We don't want that. So it's only if we're successful that we're going to call this function again. Once we have our database connection, we need to create our transaction. Where we provide the name of the store that we're connecting to. We've got the name of the database when we call open. The transaction is on the store. Are you going to be reading or writing? We're only going to be reading the data. We're not going to be updating anything. So it's read only. This is the store that we're going to talk to. So on here, we're going to make our request to get all the data from that store. Not passing in any parameters. I just want everything. Once I have it, so I'm going to call the onSuccess. This is where I'm going to actually build that list. So inside the UL, this one right here with the ID people, inside of this, we're going to create this list of people. And then our people object, our array of data, is going to be everything that we've saved inside of here. So these objects, this is people. It's this column right here of values. So people is going to be the request event right here, dot target, dot result. That is going to be the array of values. So we can loop through that. And we're going to replace the previous inner HTML with our new version here. So we're going to call people.map. And for each person in this array of data, the person is going to be the object. So this is a person, this is a person. So we could console log as we write them out just to see it. And what we should see is each of these objects being written out. Our map method, we're going to return a string. Well, it's actually going to return an array of strings. So after the map method is done, we're going to take this array of list items and we're going to join them all together with an empty string, or we could do a new line character, whatever we want. Inside of here, I'm going to have the person ID. So that field is going to be inside this data ID attribute, just in case in the future I need to reference it. And then I'm going to have person.name. And I want to have an input element of type color. Same thing that I'm using in the form right here. This one. So it's one of these color elements. I'm going to put that beside each one of the names, except I'm going to set it to disabled so people can't click on it to change the color. So type color, doesn't matter about the ID. The value is going to be coming from that array. So we'll say it's person.color, and then disabled is going to prevent them from doing anything with it. Okay. So we've changed this file. The web page is using a cached version of that. Down here in the static cache, this app.js, we have to replace that one. So we do need to replace the current service worker. Come back here, we'll change the version, which is also going to change the version of the database, but that's okay. We're not going to lose our data just because we do this. So we skip waiting. Color store, I can refresh it. It still has the same data. It's just a different version. There it is, version 3. So version 3 has the same data. There's the ones that we put in before. And there we are. And because these are disabled, clicking on them doesn't do anything. And that's it. That is the whole life cycle, working with service workers from both the browser and in the service worker, how they can use the post message to send data back and forth. So I hope that answers your questions about how to integrate things. If you have any other questions about this, feel free to leave those down below. I'll answer as many as I have time for. If you look down in the description, you'll find a link to the whole playlist. You'll also find a link to the code from this video. And as always, thanks for watching.